Okay, so just brief summary. Your teaching philosophy statement is a brief 1 to 2 page summary of your primary lens or goals for how you teach and why you teach. Does that make sense to everybody? Yeah, cool. And once again, we are a cafe. Feel free to engage however you want, whether it's raising your hand and using that function with this when we're in open discussion, shouting out, or using the chat function in Zoom. Please be respectful of each other. That's, you know, basic 101, I think, in any setting, but we always like to remind people. And then we're really glad you're here and we're glad you want to join us. So today we're going to cover what are the key elements of teaching philosophy statement, what are some best practices for teaching philosophy statement, when, where, and how do we use the teaching philosophy statement. So, as I said, the TPS, or teaching philosophy statement, is a narrative essay that highlights your teaching beliefs and practices. So what are your primary lenses? What are the primary goals of your teaching? So as somebody who's been working and trained through Cafe for the last 2 years, one of my primary lenses when I teach is accessibility and ethics in the way in which I engage with my students, in the way in which I put together my materials for my classes. I want them to be ethical and accessible to as many students, if not all of my students, as possible. So those would be my core beliefs, and the practices that I engage with are centered around those ideals. Does that make sense to everybody? Yeah. I'm also engaged.
Jessi.
Yes.
Oh, sorry to interrupt. We do have a comment in chat. I think you're kind of already leading up to it or answering it currently, but I just wanted to point it out. There's a remark saying, I know what a teaching philosophy statement is. However, what exactly is its purpose?
Sure. So we're going to get to that. So it is a way, the teaching philosophy statement is a way you articulate how this looks. So it's kind of a picture into what your classroom looks like, because you're going to use practical examples of those kind of nebulous ideals that you have. And it gives a picture to the schools you're applying to associations that you're connected with, to anybody who's looking into your research, of your unique way of engaging and teaching. So that is the purpose. It is to highlight your unique composite of you as a teacher and what your primary lenses and goals are as a teacher in the classroom. Does that answer that question? Yeah? Okay. So we're going to keep moving on. If there's more clarity to that question, we can kind of get to it. So the core elements that the teaching philosophy statement relays to future employment, your students, anybody who's looking at your website as an educator, are going to be: why do you teach? What do you teach? Where do you teach? And how do you measure your effectiveness in doing that? So that last component is really important. Even though teaching is not, it's not math, right? It's not one answer for the same thing, right? It's not a plug by numbers, but there are ways to measure how we are doing what we hope to do effectively. And that's an important component of what we're thinking about when we're teaching and when we're talking to people about how we teach and what we teach. Does that make sense? And we have some images here. If you know the story Matilda, the figure on the left is an example of a great teacher, Miss Honey, and the Trunchbull figure on the right is the example of totalitarian, traditional kind of teaching pedagogies. So kind of what we definitely at Cafe would not advocate for, but it may be something you encounter. Do we have any more? What are the questions in the chat, Holly?
There was a question about whether or not the recording would be available, and I did answer and say yes. Just so everyone knows, the recording will eventually be posted probably later this week to the website along with those PowerPoint.
Along with this PowerPoint, yeah. Okay, so what are the purposes of it? As I said, it's professional and pedagogical. It's for you to think about how you teach and for you to explain to other people how you teach, because sometimes we do things naturally and we don't always unless we think about it, understand the reasons why. And so it's a way to create space to think about, how do I teach, what's important for me, and why. It's a way to clearly explain and engage with your teaching and how you teach and why you teach and what you teach and the ways you teach. It's also a space for you to continue as an educator to go back and rethink about, how am I teaching? I had an email earlier last week when this webinar was announced from a scholar at Claremont who's like, I am rethinking my teaching philosophy statement because of all of this new ChatGPT AI stuff is like throwing me off. And so what we advocate for is reviewing your teaching philosophy statement probably every year to every 2 years, depending on where you are in the job market. If you are in a long-term tenure track position, if they still exist, then that's a place where you're going to maybe review this a little bit less often. Whereas if you're on the job market or you're adjuncting or you're in school finishing your program, you're going to look at this more and more as you're getting more experience and as you may be shifting how you teach. I have a friend who is an English professor, and she said, when she started out adjunct teaching, when she started in her master's, she was very much like, I'm going to teach this way. This is how it's going to be. And as soon as she got in the classroom, she completely reoriented her teaching pedagogy, the philosophy she had behind how she taught and why she taught, even though the things that she was teaching were the same. And so the teaching philosophy statement is a way for us to continue to review our goals and our ethics and the lenses in which we're using, because you may come across a new pedagogy and it completely reorients how you are engaged in the classroom. It's also structure and scaffolding for our thoughts and for our examples. When we're going to a job, they're going to ask potentially, give us an example of how you teach ethical pedagogy in your classroom or how you engage in ethical pedagogy. And you want to have that already generated. You want to have places where you've kind of thought through that and structured that thought process. It gives the concepts of learning and the evidence of learning that you've already learned in your programs and how and why you teach the way you teach. It's a description of your teaching and your core beliefs as an educator. It gives you goals for you and your students. What are your goals for you and your students? You can go back to your teaching philosophy and say, well, my goal is for my students to engage in curiosity. So how am I structuring how I think about teaching to create that environment? It also helps you think about equity and inclusivity as an educator. And those aren't necessarily things we're taught. Depending on our programs, that we have to kind of seek them out. I'm in the religion and gender studies department, and in the gender studies department, we talk a lot about accessibility because it's a core value of certain kinds of feminist pedagogies that we're working out of. As a religion scholar, depending on my professor, we talk about equities, but not always is that something that comes up in my department, because typically religious studies hasn't been as engaged in equity and inclusivity. And so it's something that we have to be intentional about teaching. And it's something that as an educator, I have to be intentional about teaching, because I've been trained in other pedagogies and other departments that help me be intentional about that. And then their teaching philosophy is also a space where you can talk about emerging techniques and emerging activities and emerging pedagogies that you're engaging in, especially when you're going to a new job, or you're applying for new jobs, or you're coming out of school and you want to represent yourself in a different way, or you've been adjuncting for a long time and you want to get that long-term full-time job. It's a way to express, like, these are the new ways that I am continuing to educate myself as an educator. That makes sense to everybody? I know this is a lot of talking point right now. So in regard to that, we're going to watch a 2-minute video on tips. This video came from there. Just as an aside, that's a really good resource to utilize if you're not utilizing it. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to take 2 minutes and just have you think about, as you're thinking about reframing your teaching philosophy statement, or what inspires your teaching philosophy statement. We're just going to do a minute or two of that reflection time, and then we can talk about that as well. Sound good? So you have 2 minutes. We're gonna start back in let me get my calendar at 3:23 or 1, sorry. I'm on the East Coast, so it's 12:23. So take 2 minutes, write, think about those questions, and we'll be back in 2 minutes to talk. You can turn off your camera or mute, whatever you need to do. So you've got about 30 more seconds for thinking about what inspires your teaching philosophy statement. And just finish up, and we're gonna come back, and if people want to share, you can share. If not, we'll keep going through the PowerPoint and we can talk after we're done. So would anybody like to share anything that stood out to you as you were reflecting in that short amount of time?
I can. It's really quick if you don't mind hearing it. A long time ago, I met, and this is probably what even inspired me to pursue my PhD and want to teach after retiring from my current job. I met Michael Sandel, who's a professor at Harvard. He teaches really philosophy, political philosophy in particular, which is my area of study. And he teaches a course called Justice at Harvard, which is the most popular course at the school. They have to hold it in a theater. They have so many people. And what struck me about that, I read his book, I met him, is that he really not forces, but gets these students engaged in what is really critical thinking. In the first class, he presents Kant's dilemma about the train car that will kill either a bunch of people or that can be diverted to kill one. And he walks through their reasoning for making one choice or the other. And that is the kind of critical thinking and engagement that I would like to inspire in students on the subject of political philosophy, to really get them to apply that kind of critical thinking to political theory, and then apply those political theories to contemporary society. That's what I would like my students to leave with.
Thank you for sharing that, Mark. That's great. That's, I think, an important thing no matter what your field is in. So thank you so much, Maria. I saw your hand up.
What is inspiring me to teach is that I think I have always wanted, and I still want to work on deconstructing what oppresses, deconstructing the normalization of oppressive behavior with Latina women. And I have gone to Mexico City to just learn about Mexican women. And there was so much that is like, my goodness, there's so much information that is good to know. I would love to have all this and bring it to, students in a city college, with Latina women. I'm hoping that I will be teaching Latina women in city college, and very especially about machismo behavior. So that's what is inspiring me to teach.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you.
Did anybody else want to share before we move on? You don't have to. There's no obligation to share.
There is a comment in chat that someone shared. It reads, my reflection, the sense of sharing to enhance the notion of community.
I love that. That's a great, thank you for sharing that, whoever shared that. Community is a core value, I think, for anybody who's going into teaching, because why would we teach if we're not engaged with some sense of community and some sense of engaging a community mindset? Cool. Well, shall we move on to the next slide? All hearts clear? Yeah, okay. So general guidelines when we're going to write this teaching philosophy statement are things like, as I said in the video, brief and well written. On average, you probably want to keep your teaching philosophy statement between 1 and 2 pages in length. The caveat being, if you do happen to be one of the lucky people who gets a tenure track level position, you're going to have to expand it to about 3 to 5 pages for your tenure review. However, the school that you're working for does that process. But that would be a piece of your portfolio for your tenure, is your teaching philosophy statement. It's a key aspect of that. You want to use a narrative first person approach. So this is a personal essay. This is about who you are and what you're doing as an educator. And so you want to be personal and reflective about it. You want to make it specific rather than abstract. So what I suggest to people is start with like 2 to 3 core values that you have as an educator, and then specifically ground those as you're moving forward in the essay. So you can talk about, I have a girlfriend who's an intersectional feminist. So her teaching philosophy statement, excuse me, I'm getting overfilled, is really about that kind of core value for her. And then she specifies how she does that in her pedagogy, in her structure, in the modalities that she's using in the classroom, and even in the ways in which she structures access to her courses, because she teaches as a public scholar. And so she's able to create tiers that mirror accessibility and lack of accessibility in the way in which she structures her classes. And you want to be discipline specific. Like, don't ignore the research you are doing as a scholar in your field. How are you changing your field or fields if you're interdisciplinary scholar? You want to avoid super jargon and technical terms, because not everybody who's reading your teaching philosophy statement is going to be an educator in your field, and you want them to be able to understand what you're saying. And this isn't repeating your CV. So you want to pull up 1 or 2 key examples. You want to give an idea through those examples of what you look like in the classroom. You want to be sincere and unique. So show your passion for whatever you're doing, whether it's, Mark, someone teaching political philosophy, or whether it's Maria teaching the experience of Latin women, or whatever your space is. Be passionate and sincere about your space. Also be humble. Mention that your students are enthusiastic and things like that, but not in an arrogant way, in a kind, gentle, like, my students tended to love this activity and that was really cool, that kind of stuff. And this is an ongoing process. This is not a finish it and you're done process, you're going to revise your teaching philosophy statement for probably every institution you work at to some point. A good rule of thumb is to look at the language they're using for the job posting or that department and their core values, and find a way to put their core values and their core aspects for their students in your teaching philosophy statement. So an example of that is last year, I applied for a job at a liberal Christian affiliated university in Southern California. And one of the things I did in my teaching philosophy statement was take their core ideas of locality for students and their diverse student populations, and that engaging global issues. And so that was how I used their language in my teaching philosophy statement for that school. And that's a good rule of thumb. Because you don't want to send in a teaching philosophy statement that's all of this very diverse coded language and be stuck applying for a job in Florida, where right now, unfortunately, no matter how diverse the school is, you're going to get flagged and not probably get the job purely because of the politics in that state currently around certain language. So be mindful of that. So do's and don'ts, this is from Cornell University's suggestions on teaching philosophy statements. Don't give idyllic but empty concepts. So you want to anchor whatever your core values are to some practical examples of what it looks like in the classroom for you to do that, or projects that you've done with your students. As we said, you don't want to repeat your CV. You do want to research the institutions that you are applying to and their core values and what they find important. You want to keep it short, brief, pithy, 1 to 2 pages. You want to provide examples and evidence of what those core values look like in the classroom. You do want to discuss the methods, the lessons you're learning, the challenges, innovation, things that your students have learned from being in your classes or teaching with you. If you haven't taught students, think about spaces where you do teach, because you're probably teaching, even if you don't think of it as traditionally teaching, you have experiences of teaching. And what was well received. So if you are currently a student at CGU and you're in our programs, you often have to give lecture for your whole class on some topic, right? For one of your classes, that is teaching. So think about that as a teaching example, and what were reactions to what you presented? What did you present dynamically that people engaged with? Did you use videos? Did you do role playing? And what worked really well, and use that in your teaching philosophy statement if you don't have the practical in classroom experience yet. Do you discuss your connections between your teaching, your research, and service? Service is a big thing that a lot of schools want their educators to be involved in, and dynamic engagement. So if you're really interested in teaching justice to your students in a political way, how are you engaging with what's happening in the political realm, or encouraging them to find places to engage with advocacy, because that's a core value of teaching and the research you're doing, and it's something you're offering to your students. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. So we're going to take another 2 minutes and reflect on what stands out to you about these guidelines. Is there anything, what seems manageable? Is there anything that feels challenging? And then we'll chat again afterwards, and then we're almost done, and we'll get to the Q&A part. Sound good? So 2 minutes at 12:37, we're going to be back. So take 2 minutes. We have about 30 seconds left. Okay, so we're gonna jump back into chatting. If anybody feels comfortable and wants to share what you reflected on, you're more than welcome to. If not, we can keep moving on and you can see those reflections for our Q&A. Did anybody feel like they had anything they would like to share that stood out to you? You don't have to. Okay, so we're gonna move on and just keep going. And then when we do the Q&A, if something stands out to you and you want to jump in and share it, feel free. So when and how.
Oh, I do see a comment. Sorry, Jessi, in the chat. Let's see. The comment reads, unless Tamar, you wanted to share it yourself, or I don't know if you're comfortable with me reading out loud for you.
I can read it out loud.
Okay.
I'm having a sinus issue, so my head feels like it's being squeezed. So that's why I'm typing more than speaking. It's great to see everybody today. Good to be here. I wrote, I find the challenge for me resides in the administratorization of academia, and I want to develop my language in communicating with the admins and managers involved in hiring and managing, while also remaining forward thinking in my pedagogic approach. And I think for me, what I keep returning to is it's not only the classroom, it's also the institution. And in CAFE, formerly PFF, we often talk about legacy thinking and legacy systems in education. And for example, sometimes there's a term, rigor. Rigor is one of those opaque terms that many institutions from middle school to high school to grad school, it's like, we must be rigorous. And I don't believe in that, and so how do I translate or communicate my approach, which is empathy centered and co-creation centered to individuals? And I know there's an assumption here that I'm making that maybe they may not agree with me, but how do I communicate my approaches and my wish for my classroom and for the learners involved, which includes me, in a way to somebody who may not necessarily have the same perspective?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Tamar. I feel you on the sinuses. This East Coast weather has been awful. I'm not sure. I think my thought would be, think about what do you think you can assess they mean from rigor, and then break that down and figure out how you can communicate what you're doing in a way that they might hear. Because, especially for those of us who are trained, who have been through the PFF program, right? It's very forward thinking. And even setting up my syllabus for the class I'm teaching in the fall, I wanted to do, what is it? A certain kind of grading, right? But the way I've been trained to do that grading, it's a form of contract grading where the students complete a certain percentage of the work and they get a certain grade. The problem is I'm teaching a writing class. So how do we assess whether they completed the writing while also doing a contract-based grading where they complete certain percentages? So I am having to rethink how I'm going to grade this class in an ethical way that still supports my values, but also adheres to the fact that they're on an ABCD grade scale, and I have to have certain competencies met by my students. So anytime we have a conflict like that, I think as we're approaching our TPS or as we're approaching job stuff, I would try to unpack what the intentionality of the community is with the words or phrasing or policy they're using, and then figure out how you can work dynamically within the system. Anybody else questions before we move on? No, we're good. Okay. So when and how do I use this, right? We've already talked a lot about how it's a key component for job applications. I think most job applications that I've seen for teaching jobs, unless they're the kind like I have now where somebody in the department said, send me your resume because I know you through someone and we need to hire for this. So they're not asking for the full job materials, is applying for jobs. It's also something you can use in the classroom. You can use it to show your students why and how you're teaching them the way they are, especially if you're getting pushback. We can create, collapsed versions of our teaching statement or our diversity statements and put them in our syllabi so they kind of know why you're doing the way you're doing what you're doing in the classroom. We also use it as a way to continue to reflect and revise and hone our teaching skills as educators. They can be included as part of your bio or public speaking materials. If you have a Scholar website, it's a place where you would put that in with all of your other job talk materials. It's a really good way to explain to somebody how you're doing what and why you're doing what you do as an educator. You can use it for the first day of your class to explain to your students in a practical way, this is how I'm gearing our class and this is why, and this is where I come from. And if you teach in a non-traditional setting, you can use it at the beginning of a lecture or workshop to explain your methodology to the people you're working with. We're going to skip over this next reflection, but if you would like to write it down, I'm going to give 30 seconds to write it down and you can come back and look at it later for yourself. The question that we would have is, what are unique perspectives and experiences that you bring to the classroom as an educator? So I am not neurotypical. So that is one of the specific things that I bring to the classroom when I'm educating, is a mindfulness of having grown up in a very traditionalist education system as a non-neurotypical student who didn't think I would ever get my PhD because of that. So I have a sensitivity, I think, hopefully towards non-neurotypical students in the room because of that scenario. And this will also, these reflections will be on the PowerPoint. So if you don't have enough time or don't want to write it down now, you can download it later after when the PowerPoint gets posted. These are also, this question specifically is something that we have in the CAFE materials for helping people write teaching philosophy statements. And that's a one-page document that you can connect with any of the fellows and we can send to you. It's also something that if you take our classes is in the textbooks. So now we're at the Q&A, so I'm going to stop screen sharing. So does anybody have any questions